Hello, hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sasha Goodfriend, and I am the Executive Director of MassNOW. And give it up to yourself for coming so early on a Saturday morning to our third annual Menstrual Equity Summit. We're going to begin with a little hello from one of our co-sponsors, Grace from Our Bodies Ourselves, to say a few words. So please join me in welcoming Grace.
Wow, thank you. Can everyone hear okay? I can turn up the volume if not. We're good?
Go a little louder.
A little louder. Okay. 1 second. How about now?
That is better, thank you.
All right, perfect. I'm going to just start us off with a land acknowledgement, which we like to do here at Suffolk. So, Our Bodies Ourselves acknowledges that Boston is located on the traditional unceded territory of Indigenous people who have been brilliant stewards of the land and water for hundreds of generations. Specifically, the Massachusetts and Wampanoag First Nations peoples, along with particular recognition for the Pawtucket, Neponset, and Nipmuc peoples who have traveled, lived, worked, and cared for the lands in and around Boston for tens of thousands of years. We extend our respect and gratitude to all First Nations people who continue to live and steward in the cultural, spiritual, and educational customs of their ancestors. We acknowledge the overwhelming violence, physical, cultural, environmental, and spiritual, that has been inflicted by colonialism for over 400 years, which continues to this day to profoundly affect the lives of Indigenous peoples. We express our deep respect and appreciation for Massachusetts women, men, children, and elders, both leaders and ordinary people. We also know that a land acknowledgement is not enough and commit our bodies ourselves to honoring and lifting up Indigenous voices and perspectives in all of our work. Thank you for that. So, hello everyone, good morning. Thank you for coming so early. My name is Grace Cook. I am the Program Associate for Our Bodies Ourselves here at Suffolk University. We are so thrilled to be hosting this amazing event again with MassNOW. And I just want to say I'm especially grateful to MassNOW, which was like my first step into feminist activism. So thank you for welcoming me, Sasha. It's come a long way now. Yeah, it's so great to be here. So this is just a moment for you today. Take a moment to connect with somebody and build your network. And like, it's so important in this moment to have this community, and everyone has a place no matter where you are in your activist journey. So I just wanted to say a little bit about Our Bodies Ourselves. Many of you probably know Our Bodies Ourselves from our history, going back to the Boston Women's Health Book Collective in 1969, and the many publications of the book Our Bodies Ourselves that inspired and shaped the women's health movement. Our Bodies Ourselves has always been an educational activist initiative supporting the health and sexuality of women and gender-expansive people. OurBodiesOurselves.org was launched in 2022 at Suffolk University. So our website is an accurate and inclusive guide to health, sexuality, and reproductive justice. You can learn more about us at our table over there. We work with over 100 content experts, including Sasha, and there's some more in the room today, which help us develop and curate trustworthy, evidence-based, feminist resources and compelling personal stories in 11 different subject areas, including topics like menstruation, menopause, mental health, growing older, sexuality, and so much more. So we really just love hosting events like this here at Suffolk that share health information and really build our community around reproductive justice. So thank you. We're happy to be in space with you today, and I'm excited to listen and learn along with you of our amazing speakers.
I am just still taking in how incredible it is that you are all here. This started out as a pipe dream a few years ago, where I was like, we should do a menstrual equity summit because there's so much going on and we need to get our coalition all together. And then I was like, who's gonna wanna come? And I'm just so impressed that everyone is here because there is so much to learn. I've been working with MassNOW for 13 years. MassNOW has been leading the Menstrual Equity Coalition for the last 6 years, and every single year we learn more and more about periods, more than I even thought I could know. And that is the goal for today, that everyone, I'm sure, knows a lot about periods from your own personal experience, but that we can really dig into some of the new and emergent research that is happening, so that we can become more informed about the choices we can make around our own menstrual health. So MassNOW has been organizing for feminist democracy for over 50 years. We've been able to work in service with our sister organization, Our Bodies Ourselves, for decades. And I know that a lot of times it feels like, especially in 2025, we're going backwards and we're fighting for the exact same issues as when we were founded. And yet I'm really energized to be here in Massachusetts, where we have really strong feminist leadership, both here in Boston at the city council level and on the executive level at the State House and with our governor. And so we have opportunities here in Massachusetts to scale up solutions that work. And a lot of that work is happening in cities and towns all across Massachusetts, and it's our job to advocate and raise visibility around that, because we know periods are not new. We have been bleeding forever as a species, and yet until 2019, when MassNOW introduced our menstrual equity legislation, it had never been discussed as a policy issue. And so I know, it's shocking. That's what we're here today to do, to be connecting the personal to political. And it's our goal that after today, not only do you learn more about menstrual health and your own personal advocacy as a patient navigating your own menstrual health, but also that you feel empowered to share your story with elected officials so that we can make systemic change here in Massachusetts. I want to start by giving a few very important thank yous. First, I want to ask the MassNOW team, Kyla, Kathy, Nicole, to raise your hands. Oh, there you are. Don't be shy. And they might be out of the room too. Please give a huge thank you to the staff that put on today's summit and the intern team. You can see them wearing purple shirts. This is actually our third time doing the summit and our second time this calendar year. So we've been very busy. I also want to give a huge shout out to our sponsors today. We have Unicorn, every stall in the back with Ellen, and they have quality products, tampons and pads. You can also see them in the bathrooms here. They did a pop-up of menstrual products. This is especially helpful for me today because my period is 4 days late. And I've been tracking my period for 9 years, longer than I've known my wife. And every single month it is different. And I don't understand how we're just supposed to, live like this, constantly wondering every day, all day, is it happening? Am I bleeding? But it was so great to come here today without having a menstrual product on me, ironically. But they were there in the bathroom, in the stall, right when I needed them. That is the menstrual equity utopia in practice that we are able to do a little bit here, and you need to see it to believe it. So it might sound like it is a little bit of a small thing, but it's also a big thing to really be changing the structural way we feel about access to menstrual products and can see it too. I'm also thrilled to thank the Mass Trans Political Coalition for sponsoring today's summit. We've partnered with them for the last few years on trans period pride consciousness raisings, which has been really great to diversify our conversations and our policy advocacy around how we define success and access for menstrual products. And we'll hear more about those conversations in a bit from our panel. I think those were the only housekeeping things that I needed to say today. I guess I'll say one more thing in my intro, which is that this year we're having our Menstrual Equity Summit as part of our MassNOW State Conference. So in the afternoon, we will be having a presentation about MassNOW's work year-round, and we'll be having a workshop about how to turn your story into advocacy. And at the end of the workshop, we'll have our election for the board. But everyone is welcome to be here throughout the whole day, regardless of if you are a member. So we hope that you become a member and support all of our feminist agenda and hear about it. But don't feel like you need to leave if you're not a member later in the afternoon. We want you to be here all day. So with that, I am now going to introduce our keynote, Dr. Sally King. And I believe,
Pull her up.
okay, we can multitask here with 2 microphones. So Dr. Sally King is a medical sociologist specializing in menstrual health and associated human rights issues. She's also the founder of the world's first evidence-based information website on this topic, Menstrual Matters. Sally integrates critically and evaluates biological, physiological, epidemiological, sociological, and popular discourse data. Her work reveals the unintentional influence of pervasive gender and racial myths in menstrual health, knowledge, and practice in the UK and beyond. Her book, Menstrual Myth-Busting: The Case of the Hormonal Female, came out this year, and today you can order it for 50% off. And I just want to say on a personal note how obsessed I am with this book. Anyone who talked to me over the couple of months that I was reading it knows, because I started every single meeting opening up the book to a page and saying, "Can you believe this?" So I'm so excited for this talk today because I think that it's going to really change the way that you think about periods. There's a lot of myths that we live with that we don't even realize are myths because we're just surviving, maybe just trying to access products. But I think that by really strengthening our narrative and seeing how these myths are intentionally perpetuated in different systems, we can really address some of the ways that we can be freer in thinking about ourselves as menstruators and more inclusive in thinking about our policy options too. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers following the keynote, and I want you to be thinking throughout the presentation about what your questions are. And then we'll have microphones that we can come around the room. I should also say that Dr. Sally King is joining us from the UK right now. So with that, help me bring a warm welcome for her joining us from miles and miles away, all the way here to Boston. Can you see us, Dr. King?
I can't see you. I can hear your voice.
Okay.
Grace.
Well, I'll send you a picture of
Oh,
the...
I can see you, and I can
great.
see me.
All
That's
right, so
weird.
everyone wave. Yay!
This is great. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Brilliant. So yeah, hi from sort of sunny Scotland. We've got about half an hour left of light, and then it's going to be getting dark because we're midwinter. It's such a privilege to be speaking to you today. Our bodies ourselves is a massive, massive influence on my work, and I still find it a super exciting movement. Hopefully that my work is part of. And the same with MassNOW, you know, such an amazing sort of historically and still this real powerhouse of good human rights work, particularly around reproductive health. So I'm super honoured. Thank you all so much for inviting me here. We'll get straight to it. So I could have gone on and spoken a lot about different menstrual health myths, because as I'm sure we're all aware, there are loads of them. But instead, I thought I'd sort of take you through a brief tour of my work over the past 10 years and how I'm really getting into why is it that menstrual myths and stigma and the concealment taboo persist, even though it's 2025, nearly 2026. We have all of this knowledge, this technology around. We've got all of these wonderful feminist movements, but still I would argue that menstrual literacy is very poor, and even what we're taught, and certainly what we're not taught, seems to be limited by something. So I'm trying to get into what is it that's holding improved knowledge and reduced stigma about menstruation and sort of associated health conditions too. So I'm going to start with a quick quiz. It can't be super interactive because of the way that this is doing, but I do want you to sort of do it in your head as if you're in the middle of a quiz. I'm going to take you through sort of some of the main menstrual myths and how what we're taught and certainly what we're not taught about our bodies has sort of major implications, not only for our health, but our status and our rights within society too. Then my more recent work's been looking at sort of reproductive health and physiology and associated myths too. And then we get to the hub of this talk, which is really about what I think is underlying still why we're taught certain things and not taught other things about our own bodies, and that is pronatalism. So we'll go into what do I mean by that? Where does it come from? And then finally, what maybe can we do about this? So we're here in a room full of highly intelligent, highly passionate people, keen on menstrual health and associated rights. So this quiz should be super easy. Some of you might be beginning to silently panic, don't worry. So my research has found that this is actually something we're not taught, particularly not at school, and not even at medical school for most people. So given that 98% of mammals do not have periods, why is it that we think humans do? Now, to be a bit kinder to you, I've given you some options here. So we've got A, do we have periods to clean out the womb? Are they a type of natural abortion? Do they prepare the womb for pregnancy? Do they somehow protect us from danger, maybe even death? Do periods signal our fertility? And then for those of you who like to hedge your bets, we've got F, which is two of those answers combined, or G, is it all of those things, A to E? So just take a couple of seconds. Don't worry about this, but sort of feel, what would you answer if this was a quiz and somebody wanted to know what you thought based on your life experience, some of the things you might have seen and read or talked about with others. So the actual answer to this often comes as a bit of a surprise to people. So the answers are B and D, but I will tell you that the most common answer that I hear, even from gynecologists, even from medically trained doctors, is more likely to be C, to somehow prepare the womb for pregnancy. But if we have a little bit of a think just for a second, what happens in the period? So the womb lining is shed from the inside of the womb, and anything that's inside the womb is also removed, including any eggs, fertilized or not. So not only is the period, it cannot be helpful for a pregnancy. And in fact, we do know that, because if we are pregnant, we know that any kind of bleeding, we have to go and get it checked out, because it's not typically a good sign for a continued pregnancy. It can be a sign of miscarriage, for example. But even just sort of thinking about that, of course, a period cannot help with a pregnancy. It's literally removing the contents of the womb. And yet most of us, and even in some textbooks, for instance, we're led to believe sort of completely the opposite, that somehow the entire menstrual cycle, so not just the ovulation part, which is all about conception and pregnancy and trying to create offspring, but also the period bit, the removal of the contents of the womb, which is super rare among mammals. We are led to believe somehow that this is still helpful for having babies. So as I said in the question, actually menstruation is super rare. It's not a mammalian thing. It's evolved sort of separately on lots of different kind of family trees. So we're primates. So all primates have periods, so gorillas, orangutans, bonobos, chimps. Some old world monkeys do. There's some species of bats. There's the elephant shrew, which is a small creature, but it's closely related to elephants. And then this guy in the corner is the spiny mouse. So that's the only rodent that we know of that has a period. And its cycle is every 9 days. So some people have it worse than us. And alongside having periods, the other sort of key physiological difference between all of those different menstruating mammals and the majority that don't have periods is this thing called spontaneous decidualization. It's a super difficult way of describing something. Spontaneous just meaning automatic. Decidualization, referring to that thickening of the womb lining. It's not just thickening, it's actually creating different types of cells and tissue. But if we just sort of thinking about it as the thickening of the womb lining, that's much simpler. And that happens a week to 10 days before we get our periods. So in the 98% of mammals that don't have periods, that womb lining only gets thicker if there's an embryo inside the womb. And in fact, it starts thickening after the placenta from the embryo begins to implant in the wall of the womb. And it's actually hormones from the embryo that signal to the womb that it better start getting thicker so that it can create the placental attachment, which is how the embryo gets nourishment from the blood of the parent. But in our case, this happens, well, it starts happening 7 to 10 days before an egg will even get anywhere near landing inside the womb. So it's happening ahead of any egg, fertilized or not, can be in the womb. Now I go into this in a lot more detail in my book and in this paper here. So Dina Emmerer is really the person who came up with this explanation, is that it seems likely, particularly sort of in the case of humans, that this would happen automatically to give some sort of survival advantage. And also that if it's happening before there's any embryo inside the womb, that it's possible that we don't know exactly how, but this process of decidualization is somehow testing the viability of any potential pregnancy. And again, particularly given the case of humans, we have really high rates of unviable and abnormal sperms, eggs, fertilized eggs, you name it, and also placental attachments. They're either too deep or they're not deep enough. There are all these different reasons why a pregnancy wouldn't be viable, wouldn't really last for 9 months and result in a healthy birth. And being pregnant is very costly to us. The embryo is sort of taking nutrients from the parent for all of that time, particularly iron, but also some other nutrients. So the fact is that the period is a type of natural abortion. The word abortion just meaning that loss of the contents of the womb, which is its technical meaning. And the theory behind why we might have periods, particularly why we might have this automatic thickening ahead of the period, is that it's a way to protect us from the dangers of unviable and potentially dangerous pregnancies. So again, I'm super interested in how this is well established within fertility physiology, for example, reproductive physiology. But within fertility, a period is seen as a failed pregnancy, right? So all of that kind of knowledge about menstruation and the period isn't of most significance within fertility. But why then are we still not taught it just as part of menstrual health or knowing about our bodies? And why, in fact, are we kind of taught the opposite? That somehow the whole menstrual cycle, not just the ovulation part, but also the bleeding and the decidualization part, is somehow helpful for pregnancy. So this is kind of where my work has come from and is going to. So for my PhD, which I completed a few years ago, I was looking at cyclical symptoms. So I'm the founder of Menstrual Matters, which is an online website, and it's evidence-based information about menstrual health and associated rights issues. And as part of that, I regularly have to review the literature on cyclical symptoms, commonly sort of typically referred to as PMS or premenstrual syndrome. And what I noticed, so as part of my doctoral research, I spoke to some of the world's experts in PMS and PMDD. And the way that they spoke to me about menstrual physiology seemed quite limited. In the process of these interviews, I began to think, why is it that they're just talking about sex hormones? Because menstrual physiology is far more than that. If you think about an egg bursting through the wall of the ovary during ovulation, if you think about these tissues being created, there's a lot of blood flow to the womb when that's happening. And then the period itself, this highly inflammatory physical process that we feel, right? We get these muscular contractions that are really painful. We get the spread of prostaglandin, which are a type of hormone, from those womb muscles to our guts. We get constipated, we get diarrhea, you name it. These physical sort of elements of physiology were missing from these discussions about cyclical changes. So probably back in about 2020, I reviewed the content of textbooks commonly used in medical education. So both what we're taught at high school, so in the UK and Europe, we have to be taught something about reproductive health, particularly sort of how babies are made by the age of 16. So I looked at the content of those sorts of textbooks, those that we get sort of in biology at age 18, and then biology and medical degrees at university. And I found that actually menstrual physiology just isn't taught. So even within sort of reproductive textbooks, reproductive health textbooks, obst and gynae specialist textbooks, menstrual physiology is primarily reduced to just that kind of hormonal coordination of these events. And this is a problem. So if you're just thinking about the sex hormones and how they coordinate things, you're missing out all of these physical changes. And in particular, a lot of the changes that people describe as PMS are actually just the inflammatory changes that we would expect to be happening with the healthy events of the menstrual cycle. And in fact, anti-inflammatory interventions, that could be medications, maybe being on the contraceptive pill, which has the effect of suppressing ovulation and or the period. And so it sort of reduces how big an inflammatory effect those events have. Or even through sort of diet and lifestyle, anti-inflammatory mechanisms can really solve or alleviate most people's cyclical symptoms. And if not, so if you're having regularly severe symptoms, it's far more likely that you have an underlying condition. So it could be anemia, iron deficiency, that's super common in the menstruating population. Fibroids, again, super common. Endometriosis, also pretty common in the population. All of these conditions that we're told are really difficult to diagnose and take many years sometimes to be diagnosed and treated. When in fact, as soon as you bring in, if you only understood healthy menstrual physiology, it's actually quite easy to differentiate between inflammatory processes that respond to anti-inflammatories versus regularly severe symptoms, typically that are indicative of something else, a pathology underneath that needs to be, well, somebody needs to be examined and then hopefully diagnosed and treated. So based on my work on PMS, I wrote my book. And at this conference, if you go to the Policy Press website and use that code, you'll get 50% off, especially for this conference. And that lasts to the end of December, so you've got a bit of time. And really, there's a lot in there about what's missing in education regarding menstrual physiology and the impact that has had, particularly on the diagnosis and treatment of people for PMS and PMDD. But my work is now sort of moving on a bit. And I want to kind of look at, well, that was menstrual physiology. And when I was thinking about, I don't really understand not only why we're not taught these things that have very real and meaningful impacts in our lives about what's happening in our bodies, and reduce some of that mystery. Because when you sort of think, oh, it's my hormones, that doesn't really adequately describe why you might be in so much pain, or why you might become constipated, or why you have these effects and somebody else doesn't. I thought, I wonder what else we're taught and not taught regarding reproductive bodies and reproductive health more generally. So most recently, I've been doing that same thing of comparing, well, what are doctors taught, what are scientists taught in their education. And I've looked beyond menstrual physiology to male and female reproductive processes. And I thought of particularly the ones that maybe we would most like to know more about, particularly in regard to why these things happen to us. And the first thing that I noticed that the doctors are taught about this, but we're not taught this at school. And I think this has really led to this kind of massive myth, the idea of the hormonal female, but also the idea that men are not hormonal, this kind of counter implied myth that the sexes are sort of categorically different. Our bodies render us, particularly our reproductive bodies, very different emotional, behavioral patterns, but particularly that the idea that we're liable to emotion based on our bodies, that we have no control over it, whereas men are these steady, allegedly sort of reactionless, automaton kind of rational beings, when in fact the production of sperm and the production of ova, the eggs, are almost identical in their hormonal coordination. It's just that the sperm production is much more constant, so it's not on this sort of 3 to 6 week, roughly monthly cycle, but these kind of overlapping cycles that are constant to allow a constant supply of sperm. So, you know, if anyone's hormonal, maybe if you're talking in terms of reproductive bodies, it would be the male one. And this isn't just a sort of silly myth. This really underlies a lot of issues, particularly in healthcare, such as medical misogyny. So the idea of the hormonal female sits exactly on top of the myth of the hysterical female. It is the same myth. It's the sort of current day version of it. And it's the idea that it's not our fault, but through our bodies, through being female, we are pathologically emotional, prone to irrationality, outbursts, and we can't be trusted when describing symptoms, for example. We might be prone to exaggeration, invention, or even psychosomatically creating pain through this kind of emotional experience. And this is also racialized, this myth. So you don't have, it's not only female myth, the hormonal female, it's the hormonal other with a big O. So it's any marginalized population you want to name it. You diminish their rights and their rationality by calling on their idea that their biology is different and they're simply not able to be treated on an equal basis to cis white heterosexual men. You know, but it's a major feature of othering in general, but particularly sexism, is this sort of idea of male and female bodies being one rational, one irrational. So also looking at what we're not taught are kind of all the cool things about human reproduction, all the really interesting, rare, and things that would be quite meaningful for us to understand, particularly at school, I would say. So the fact that we conceal ovulation, no other mammal, as far as I know, hides when they're fertile. In fact, most mammals demonstrate it sort of either through behaviors or through visible signs that they're fertile. We conceal it. In fact, we often don't know if we've ovulated ourselves unless we actually track it, take our temperature, check where our cervix is. It's quite a lot of labor involved to know whether we've ovulated. This is interesting. We don't actually know why we would conceal it, but I would say it brings up some interesting questions about why people who concealed their fertility were more likely to survive, put it that way. We also have a reasonably high rate of anovulation. So these are cycles where we might have a period at the end of it, but we haven't ovulated. So this happens particularly just when you start your period, when you're young, and also towards the menopause, you get more and more of these cycles where you'll have a bleed and you'll have an irregular cycle length, and it's because you haven't actually ovulated. But even during those middle years, when you're having a healthy natural cycle, around 20% of cycles don't involve ovulation. Compared to other mammals, we have very low rate of conception. So it's about 1 in 4, and that's with both partners being fertile, having heterosexual penetrative sex, sperm getting near the egg, all of those things, it's still only 1 in 4, which is a bit lower than other mammals. We've already mentioned how spontaneous decidualization and menstruation are very rare, only 1 to 2% of mammals. And also how in humans our menstrual flow is much, much heavier than other primates, in fact, than any other mammal, which could be important. So for instance, that could help explain why we undergo menopause as well, because we've lost so much blood and become iron deficient, which in itself is a big risk, particularly for childbirth, for example. We have really, really high rates of miscarriage, particularly very early miscarriages. It's thought that 40 to 60%, so nearly most conceptions are lost, particularly in the very sort of early few days and weeks. And even beyond 12 weeks, we have a rate of about 12% miscarriage rate, which again is higher than other mammals. We have the most invasive placental attachment, which is another cause of illness and potential death in pregnancy and childbirth. We have relatively high rate of maternal mortality. This varies, as you will know, from state to state, from country to country. Basically, you need to have access to basic medical checks in order to overcome perfectly avoidable, usually changes in blood pressure, signs of infection, those sorts of things. But left to our own devices, lots of people die during childbirth and just after. Another interesting thing is other primates don't experience eclampsia or preeclampsia. That seems to be a human-only thing. I think there could be more research into that. It sounds super interesting. And then, of course, menopause This is even more rare than menstruation. And then the other mammals that have the menopause, they all live in the sea. So we're the only land mammal. These are super interesting facts, and we do know something about all of them, but we're not taught it. And I'll get to why in a second. We're also not taught about, generally in human societies, and this is a global stat, we have a relatively high rate of infertility. So it's perfectly normal. It's about 1 in 6 people, male and female, will experience infertility during their lifetime. But rather than normalizing it, we still see this as a pathology and something to be overcome, with the idea that this is a problem for society, for example, or for individuals. We don't know that much about menstrual menopausal health conditions. We could do, but the research funding doesn't plan to go there. And doctors know about illnesses and the risks of pregnancy and childbirth, and so do midwives. But really, I think this is another taboo, along with miscarriage. It's almost greater than the menstruation taboo. But this just isn't something that gets spoken about. It's like an unwritten rule that you don't either, sort of maybe a superstition that you don't talk about it to make it happen. But it's very interesting. So a lot of these, it's not that we haven't done the research, so we don't know anything about them. There's enough information out there, particularly within fertility, physiology and research, that you could teach it to people. It's not even particularly controversial science, it's not new, and it's certainly not as difficult as learning all those hormonal interactions and inhibitions and feedback loops. We could just tell people, okay, ovulation is inflammatory, spontaneous decidualization is inflammatory, and the period is, which is why you tend to get cyclical embodied changes around these times, and anti-inflammatories can help them. These are not difficult concepts to grasp. So we do know that it's not a scientific or a pedagogic reason. It's not difficult to teach this stuff, which sort of suggests that it's something political, or at least sort of a social factor. And through my work on menstrual health, I know for sure through the work on PMS that what we are not taught, and what we're taught instead, definitely reproduces gender norms, particularly the hormonal, i.e. the hysterical, female or other. And it also sort of reproduces biological essentialist beliefs. So the idea that all women, through association with the female body, are for having children. You know, why else are we told that the menstrual cycle, including the period, removing everything from women, somehow helps prepare for pregnancy? It's a sort of a Jedi mind trick that we've all been put under, to just sort of accept that everything about us, including the counterfactual sort of evidence we get every month, is for having children. And it sort of denies and doesn't mention all of the miscarriages, all of the sort of other data that we have that actually show that our menstrual cycle and our reproductive body is both a site for conception, but also contraception, but ultimately that it's for, our bodies are for us, protect us and our health, and protect our lives from the dangers of pregnancy and childbirth, which is quite a different message. And for instance, even the word miscarriage. So most miscarriages, like over 90%, occur because there's something wrong with the pregnancy. And it doesn't matter what you've done, what you've eaten, whether you had a vaccine, whether you went running. It just means that there was something wrong with that pregnancy, that ultimately something that you did or experienced would end it. And what it is your body deciding, not literally deciding, but detecting some sort of unviability or problem with the pregnancy and ending it to protect your life. So whilst miscarriage is always a sad, shocking, and sort of a terrible experience, I think a lot of people feel guilt and blame themselves or blame their bodies. The word miscarriage really implies you have miscarried, you have done something wrong, when in fact we could equally be taught, this is a shame, this is a horrible thing to have happened to you, but this is your body working and protecting you from this thing that wasn't going to survive. You know, it's just such a different way of framing it. So this is the kind of pronatalism that I used to have to teach, with kind of historical examples, and increasingly it's just kind of like, well, just look out of your window and you'll see this type of pronatalism. So I'm going to talk about some different types of pronatalism. This is the sort of political pronatalism, which sort of gives it a name. And really, we're just talking about a belief system or policies. And these could be state policies, they could be like religious practices, cultural practices, you name it. We have all of these. Advocate for increasing birth rates as a group imperative. There's something, it's usually us and them, more of us, fewer of them. That's sort of usually a fear-based belief about why you ought to have children, or sometimes just this is what success looks like. And this is as opposed to somebody making their own decision, ideally an informed decision about whether or not they want to have children. It's nearly always coercive. This can be directly coercive, or it can be by making your life very hard if you don't conform to marriage, children, and a certain way of behaving. It's often, well, nearly always racist, nearly always elitist in some way. And some of these images here are just, so throughout history, you get very similar images all the time, particularly with white supremacist sort of gender norms, strong gender norms about who should be doing what work. And it doesn't matter which side you're on. So we have Nazi Germany, which would be far right politics, and then we have Stalinist Russia doing very similar, almost identical white supremacy and female role from very different sides of the political spectrum. And this sort of pronatalism, again, just look out your window, you're going to see this stuff. People panicking about fertility rates and population crisis, even though there's 9 billion people on the planet. As a species, we're doing fine, absolutely fine in terms of surviving as a species. But sadly, we don't think like that. We think about us and them. We want more of us and fewer of them. And often this just reflects dominant, discriminatory and sort of harmful belief. We see the removal of reproductive rights, sort of all of them relating to education, knowledge, access to contraception, access to medications to manage health conditions, a right to safe medical abortions, reproductive health support. On a global scale, particularly the right to abortion is a massive big deal because we know it's the 4th leading cause of maternal mortality globally. And currently that's about 800 women a day. It's hundreds of thousands of women each year dying through lack of access to, well, any medical care, but including safe access to abortion. You see really weird gender norms being positioned as somehow biological, natural, and normal. Or sort of like traditional, the idea that this is how we were, if not in recent history, like 1950s US housewife, but like naturally before, like as if cave women were looking after their cavemen in the cave. And that this is always a position of inferior political rights and status. We see the rise of rape culture, the objectification and commodification of women as this happening all around us at the moment. We see entrenched and reinforced binary and sex and gender norms. Again, we're seeing this a lot at the moment. There's always kind of pro-idealized motherhood, sort of cisgendered ideas of who is and who isn't a woman, for example. And we see really weird things happening, like right-wing, I think self-identified fascists shaking hands with a Zionist, you know, very weird groups sort of bonding over these sorts of beliefs about who should be in power, and that pronatalism as being a key way to maintain that power. But what else is pronatalism? So I really do think it's likely we are just mammals and we are just primates like other primates, but there is some sort of inherent drive, or at least a group assumption. You know, we're social creatures, that we should or even need to reproduce to sort of keep the species going. And obviously this would have made sense for much of our history. And it doesn't mean that it necessarily, we can switch it off that easily, even though there's now nearly 9 billion of us. But there is just this sort of idea that we really should, a sort of security feeling, an idea of survival, not just our personal survival, but our genetic survival. And these are just great books that I highly recommend if you're into this kind of idea that some of our social norms actually come out of sort of not necessarily instincts, but genetically inherited behaviours. And then I think it's also important if we're dealing with menstrual health, because menstrual rights kind of always come back to what is menstruation, what's happening in our bodies, is to look at sometimes quite invisible, but clearly sort of structural, institutional traditions that I would say are completely pronatalist by default, not just through their historical creation, but the way that people are trained, the language that they speak, the questions they are asked, and the ones that they don't. So, for instance, in health in particular, women's health often just refers to fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and sometimes even includes infants of either sex, as if they are also women, because we are all other, of course. We see the rights of embryos, so not yet human, not able to survive, sometimes supplanting the rights or the choices of fully grown adult humans, particularly women. We have a big elephant in the room when we're talking about pronatalism, which is that fertility is a massive and growing market, literally billions of dollars every year at stake. And the more you can make people afraid of not being fertile, or the fact that 1 in 6 people will experience infertility, is a great business model. Oops. But also, as I said before, there's this issue that at the moment, so I'm a researcher in menstrual physiology. I am within a lab that ultimately works in fertility. Those are the people that know about reproductive physiology. They've mapped it all. They know, on a really detailed molecular basis what's happening. But everything they do is to do with ensuring a pregnancy. And so as soon as you get to the wrong end, to their mind, of periods or menstrual health, they're disinterested. That is just not. So they know about this stuff. They have the information. It doesn't get shared with anyone, certainly not with the public, because I can't really fault it. If you work in fertility, you are pronatalist, of course. This is your way of being. But this causes problems in terms of knowledge exchange. So it's worth having a quick think about who benefits from pronatalism. It's very, very similar to patriarchy, and I would say they kind of overlap. I always think of patriarchy, but particularly pronatalism, benefiting sons and their mums. So it's not only men that benefit from patriarchy, some women do too. And if we're thinking of kind of evolutionary explanations for patriarchy, and one of the sort of genetic ones is who controls power and decision-making over grandchildren. And most human societies traditionally were that sons would stay in the community where their mothers were, and daughters would move to other communities. And what this does is sort of set up a situation where a mother's investment in a son would translate to also her being in a position of power over the grandchildren, the next generation. Whereas daughters moving away would have to slot into mother-in-law's decision-making power. So that's just a theory, but I think it fits both pronatalism and patriarchy pretty well in that it's not only men. I think if it was just women versus men in any society, it would be much more easy to just get rid of patriarchy. But it isn't easy, and I think it's because we have all these intersecting identities at different times of our lives and within our families and things that make it difficult to kind of identify and change the way things are. It always benefits whoever's exerting or wanting to exert power, white supremacy, racist, fascists, you name it. Anyone who's sort of claiming an innate superiority over another group, they will involve pronatalist beliefs. So the idea that some women should be having more children, and also they don't care if other women are dying in childbirth, that's typically the way it works. Also, always look at the money, follow the money. A lot of the pronatalist narratives we're getting in the UK right now are funded from the US, in particular parts of the US, which is all about far-right white supremacist beliefs, often masquerading as a religion, but not really acting like a religion, and it's all money-based. So I'll finish here. So this has been a very quick tour through my work, which sort of started quite innocently off at looking at why aren't we taught more at school about the stuff we need to know about our bodies, particularly relating to menstrual health, like what's normal and what isn't. And it very quickly came to being, why aren't even doctors being taught this? And it's not from sort of lack of information, and it must be these societal influences, completely unintended. Like there's nobody sitting deciding not to train doctors in menstrual physiology or reproductive physiology. It's just that these social norms really heavily influence knowledge and the questions we ask and we talk about. So yeah, you're going to notice pronatalism everywhere, particularly in menstrual campaigning and people saying you shouldn't talk about certain things. It's a really good idea to always name it if you notice it, or if you notice it affecting the topics that you want to work on. It doesn't work for anyone. It's basically only really the elites who benefit from pronatalism ultimately, and most of us are not those people. It's really good if you feel able and safe to challenge these sorts of myths, particularly within sort of menstrual health movements. It's very easy, without judging anyone. These are really, really common beliefs, the idea that you should have children and that it's good, but we can, normalize being child-free, childless, infertile. There's lots of ways we can challenge quietly and powerfully. But most importantly for this audience and today, I think this really does underpin a lot of menstrual health myths directly, but most importantly through what we're taught and what we're not taught about our own bodies. We're still in 2025, 2026 left ignorant through no fault of our own, because if gynecologists aren't taught this, our teachers aren't taught this, our parents won't know this, where is the knowledge going to come from? And yeah, join me in trying to improve certainly medical education and then public education on these points. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. King. My mind was blown once again hearing all of that. And so I super appreciate you walking us through your book, and encourage everyone to get your own copy so that these are only the tip of the iceberg of the myths that she gets into in the book. So I really can't stress it enough. I want to see if there's anyone immediately who has a question to ask.
Can bring the mic to you.
All right, got Natasha.
It works. Hello, everybody. Hello, Dr. King. Thank you so much for your talk today. Honestly, my mind is also blown. I'm a perimenopausal woman myself, and it's a very stressful situation. I would like, I guess my question is, a term that you used today was anovulation, which is something I've never heard of until today. But it rings true for the life that I'm living right now. So could you talk a little bit more? I think you mentioned it happens often, more likely, at the onset of your period when you're young, and then again when you're starting to get through menopause. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because this is really well known within research, because it's when you're doing research on the menstrual cycle, it's annoying because the menstrual cycle takes so many days. You really want everyone to be ovulating so that you can measure hormones and all this kind of thing. But quite often people are not. So it's weird that it's really well known in one way, and yet we're not just told about it. So when you first get your period, quite often it's irregular. So you might have your first one, and then maybe only 6 months later do you start getting a more regular cycle, or they're kind of hit and miss. And then that same sort of change in length of cycle also happens around perimenopause, as you say, leading to the menopause. And often it's partly due to the fact that you're not actually ovulating. So as I said, all the other mammals wait for an embryo to give hormones for their wombs to start thickening. But we do it on the basis of what's happening in our ovary, so automatically. So every few weeks, our ovary, we've got all our little eggs in the ovary, and one of them usually gets big enough to become the dominant egg, and it comes through the wall of the ovary and it travels towards the womb. And where it made a hole in the ovary, this becomes a thing called the corpus luteum, which is why we call it the luteal phase, that second phase. And the corpus luteum sends out progestins and estrogens, and that signals to the womb to start getting thicker. But if in an anovulatory cycle, quite often the eggs do kind of grow, but they don't ovulate. And so you get lower levels of hormones coming from the ovary. And you might even, like I do, I'm perimenopausal too, I've started getting ovarian cysts instead. So I'm probably not quite popping that egg out. And because it's sitting there for ages, it becomes a cyst, which can be really painful. All these wonderful things happen with age. But because you're not having ovulation, this can alter the length of your menstrual cycle, because there's enough estrogen and progestins coming from the ovary still. And sometimes, so we also make them in our adrenal glands, which are the kidney, that you'll get some buildup of tissue and you'll get a sort of usually a lighter period. But then usually it's a shorter length cycle, which might make the next one a longer cycle and a heavier period. You know, you get into those sorts of kind of right yourself. So that's all that anovulation is. It's perfectly healthy in that it's normal to not ovulate every single cycle. And it just becomes more common at the beginning of your menstruating life and towards the end of your menstruating life, just because everything's not firing as well as it once was. So I hope that helps. It's not good, obviously, if you're trying to conceive, that's when it becomes a problem, because you need to be ovulating to be able to conceive.
Thank you, Dr. King. Everyone's mind is being blown, and Natasha just did what everyone was thinking, which is almost fall off her chair while you were talking. So I just want to illustrate to you, since you can't see us from the front, how this is resonating. We have time for one more question. Oh, I see one in the back. Great.
I'll just run back there 1 second.
Hi, thank you so much for all of the research that you've done. I've done similar research in like menstrual education and everything, and this has like provided so much clarity. I just have a question about spontaneous abortions and the risk for infection that comes with it, because you're talking about the body protecting itself with abortion, and I just wonder what like the evidence is and how the body's protecting itself when it's also at risk for infection, like if you need a DNC or anything at like 15 weeks.
Yeah, so the word abortion is just the term used for anything that removes the contents of the womb. But since the 70s, we've been taught that it's to do with elective medical abortion. And then sometimes you hear this term spontaneous abortion instead of the word miscarriage, for example. So the function, the physiological function of a period is very, very similar to a miscarriage. It's just that most periods, 450 that we have, there is no fertilized egg. So it's normal for that automatic removal of the contents is because no viable pregnancy has been detected. So it's not just something that's unviable, but if there is no viable, i.e. no fertilized egg, then the period has to happen because we've already had the thickening of the womb lining. So that's all natural, and it's perfectly natural and normal to have periods, for example, even though it is costly to our health. So having periods is bad for us. It's not, I know there's kind of alternative viewpoints, but you are losing blood, which means that you're losing iron in particular. And we know that the more blood you lose, so the heavier your periods get, because the less iron you have, the heavier periods are. And it also is a real risk for maternal mortality. So that the more iron you lose actually makes pregnancy more dangerous. So the problem is evolution doesn't care about us. Evolution only cares that we survive and that offspring survive. And clearly, the risks of pregnancy and childbirth, probably because we walk on our hind legs and our heads got really big in particular, meant that for whatever reason, having this early detection of whether a pregnancy was viable or not saved more lives than died. And it's not a perfect system because obviously we still have loads of miscarriages and we still have loads of maternal mortality. So periods haven't completely solved the human problem, which is the dangers it poses of pregnancy and childbirth. Whereas I think what you're talking about is miscarriage, so early miscarriage before 12 weeks, quite often is now called spontaneous abortion. Well, depending on where you are, because some places just don't use the word abortion to avoid the kind of political nature of right to safe medical abortion. And yes, you're right. If the embryo, which is unviable, doesn't leave the body, so if you're bleeding a bit but it hasn't left the body, that can cause infection and can be dangerous. Which is why, you know, it's always best to seek help, whoever, to speak to somebody if you're experiencing that, to experience help. But it's not quite the same thing as a period. So I'm sort of trying to say that the period is a type of spontaneous abortion, but it's not exactly the same thing as what's happening when there is an embryo in the womb. And there are different reasons why that's staying in the womb. So for instance, you can sometimes just get a period, like it seems like a heavy period and everything is removed, and that's fine. But if it isn't, you're right, you can get infections. But it doesn't mean that it's the same evolved thing that's happening. I hope that helps. It's kind of, I'm still going to say that the period is a healthy experience, even though it's kind of costly in terms of, particularly in pain and disruption in our lives. But ultimately, it meant that we survived as a species, or we're more likely to survive but bring up young.
I'm seeing lots of heads nod around the room in agreement. I know that was the part that stuck out to me most when I was reading the book, and I started saying that to everyone I talked to. I was like, did you know we're not just bleeding so that we can have kids? And often when we're teaching menstruation education in school, it's taught in the framework of pregnancy and pregnancy prevention. So I hope that everyone is taking from our conversation today about our bodies are for us, whether we want to have babies or not, and that our bodies have evolved to have the spontaneous abortion to protect ourselves because pregnancy is so painful. So I think that is so powerful to remind ourselves and reframe about what's happening to our bodies. Some of the other myths that I'll just rehash that are sticking with me from our talk today are about there's more cyclical changes happening to our body than just sex hormones. That is one of the biggest misconceptions I think that we all learn when we learn about our periods, that we're just hormonal, that our hormones are off the charts, when in fact there's a lot more inflammation that is happening. And by studying that inflammation, we can actually address a lot of the painful symptoms that we're having. And also that it's not just a woman's or biological female sex experience to have changes in our hormones. This is reminding me of many conversations I have over holiday dinners with family where my uncle asks, well, what about men? How does this impact men? And it's like, actually, I think to take away that binary of us versus them, but all humans are having changes in their hormones and cycles, they just look different, is really powerful from a feminist perspective. And the business model of the fertility market that is our opposition, I think is surprising for a lot of us maybe to hear, because we don't think of that being a business opportunity. It's really presented as a way to help people, and it also is a way to help people, but we need to be critical about capitalism and how that is impacting the options that are presented to us by the doctors. Because of course, this research is not just new, it exists, it's being intentionally not taught to us. And so by learning our own menstrual health and learning our own fertility options, we can combat the capitalist, patriarchal system that has an agenda for us and really reclaim that for ourselves. And of course, ending that men are not singularly responsible for the patriarchy, I think is really important as a feminist organization and as a woman-centered room here today to know that we all have work to do to be educating our peers of all genders so that we can have a stronger collective narrative and regain control of our health. So with that, will you raise your hand if you've already learned something new in our first hour this morning so that Dr. King can see from the back all of the hands raised? Amazing, thank you. We're gonna take a quick bio break before we start our panel. So we'll come back in 3 minutes. And join me in giving one more round of applause to Dr. King for joining us all the way from the UK. Thank you so, so much.